And we are seeing ICE presence here in Northeast Florida this week.
Right. Agents were spotted running joint operations with FHP throughout our area.
ICE raided 48 locations across 6 states. What agents found inside a Calabasas vault.
Florida, they're trying to get their hands on your money.
Yeah, so the FBI is warning, don't fall for it. As News4Jax reporter Aaron Farrar tells us, these scammers are using threats.
At 2:16 p.m., while a summer thunderstorm dragged a gray wall across the freight district west of Miami International Airport, Bay 4 at a warehouse on Northwest 74th Avenue was still doing what it had done all week, unloading shrink wrap, pallet film, and imported produce trays under fluorescent light. The building did not look like a priority target. It looked like one more corrugated box in Medley's industrial maze. Then the roll-up doors came off their rhythm. DEA agents entered through the loading side. FBI evidence teams followed through the office corridor. Miami-Dade police sealed the rear fence line as forklifts died mid-turn and radios dropped into static. Inside the dispatch room, nothing immediately justified the scale of the warrant. There were invoices, route boards, manifests, and a wall calendar full of truck numbers and ordinary delivery shorthand. Then a case agent noticed the floor bolts. The office shelving had been mounted over a seam that did not belong there. When the false platform was cut open, agents found a sunken compartment lined with moisture barriers containing 9 compressed cocaine bricks, 2 encrypted satellite phones, a flash drive sealed in vacuum plastic, and 3 port access badges issued to contractors who were not assigned to that address. That was the first shock. The second came from the drive. It contained warehouse inventories, route timings, coded shipment losses, and a protected contact sheet listing a bonded yard auditor, a customs brokerage employee, and a county fire compliance inspector beside the same notation, repeated across multiple corridors. Hold until green. And by 4 p.m., the Medley warrant had stopped being a warehouse raid and become something larger, a federal corruption and cartel logistics case centered in South Florida's freight spine. If you think the story begins with that hidden floor, go back 6 months. That is where the network first exposed itself, one bad lane change at a highway way station. The trigger came just after midnight on Florida's turnpike near Fort Pierce. A refrigerated tractor-trailer operated by Coastal Meridian Freight drifted over the fog line twice before a Florida Highway Patrol unit lit it up and directed it toward a commercial inspection pull-off. The driver, 41-year-old Daniel Velez, carried a valid commercial license, current insurance, and a clean digital log. The trailer manifest showed avocados bound for a distributor in Orlando, and the paperwork was polished. The temperature was correct. The cargo count was not. Officers noticed that the pallet totals in the digital record did not match the printed bill of lading. A secondary inspection followed. Behind 2 legitimate produce rows, agents found 63 kilograms of cocaine wrapped in carbon-lined packaging, $410,000 in vacuum-sealed currency, and a binder of carrier documents bearing stamps from a customs brokerage office in Doral and a bonded inspection yard in Medley. None of that fit the story the truck was supposed to tell. DEA Miami treated it as a significant corridor seizure. Then 2 more anomalies surfaced within 12 days. A warehouse fire inspection in Hialeah was canceled after a direct call from a private consultant with no official role in the matter. At Port Miami, as an after-hours access badge connected to a drayage subcontractor was used to enter a restricted container lane on the same night a suspected cocaine load cleared out of the bonded system without secondary review. That moved the case. DEA brought in the FBI's Public Corruption Squad. ICE Homeland Security Investigations started pulling customs entries, brokerage filings, and port access logs. Treasury analysts reviewed suspicious commercial transfers between freight firms, real estate holding entities, and equipment leasing companies. The deeper they looked, the less the Fort Pierce stop resembled a one-off seizure. It looked like leakage from an organized supply chain. Keep the canceled fire inspection in mind. It was the first sign that the network did not merely move narcotics through warehouses. It manipulated the systems that were supposed to inspect them. By the third month, investigators had mapped 14 warehouses, cross-docks, and bonded storage sites connected to the same cluster of freight firms in Medley, Hialeah, Doral, and Opa-locka. Some were used for staging. Some held cash. Some existed mainly to justify paperwork, equipment leases, or overnight inventory that vanished before daylight reconciliations. The network did not behave like a street organization. It behaved like a logistics company. Federal analysts identified 11 supply routes feeding the South Florida core, including inbound Caribbean maritime channels, interstate truck corridors through Georgia and the Carolinas, and eastbound redistribution lanes into New Jersey. The product was cocaine. The operating model was freight. And then the financial layer opened. Treasury traced payments through shell entities with names bland enough to survive casual review. Seabridge Produce Logistics, Lantern Bay Warehousing, Gulf Crescent Equipment Leasing, Portline Administrative Services. On paper, they paid for refrigeration repair, pallet handling, spoilage claims, trailer rentals, and short-term storage. In practice, prosecutors would later allege they were laundering proceeds, maintaining facilities, and paying insiders who kept the system friction-free. The evidence broadened again when agents decrypted the flash drive recovered from the false floor. It contained route codes, shipment values, warehouse identifiers, and a contact matrix linking freight personnel to outside facilitators. Several names were expected: brokers, dispatchers, yard supervisors. Others were not. So a county fire compliance inspector, a bonded yard auditor, a former customs entry clerk now working private consulting, one account labeled M. Decker, hold window. That was the first real corruption pivot. When FBI agents subpoenaed communications tied to those names, they found timing messages around inspections, documentation edits submitted minutes before cargo review, and repeated requests to delay or reroute scrutiny on loads moving through the same facilities, later tied to cocaine seizures. No single message explained the whole enterprise. Together, they did. This was no longer just a narcotics network hiding behind freight. It was a protected freight architecture that used selective institutional compromise to keep 9.3 tons of cocaine moving through ordinary commercial space before the system began to break. What looked like warehouse congestion was actually concealment. What looked like paperwork was actually protection. The machinery of the operation was sophisticated because it avoided drama. There were no spectacular tunnel systems, no convoy theatrics, no need for visible force. The network used legitimate cargo density, overlapping leases, and staged inventory movement to bury suspicious activity inside ordinary freight behavior. A trailer carrying lawful produce might clear clean. A second trailer under the same broker would carry the risk. A warehouse might receive legitimate packaging supplies at noon and transfer cocaine under revised inventory codes after midnight. That made the system resilient. Seabridge Produce Logistics handled commercial cover. Lantern Bay Warehousing provided storage churn and location flexibility. Gulf Crescent Equipment Leasing held trailers, forklifts, and industrial parcels under proxy ownership. Portline Administrative Services served as a paperwork buffer between suspicious movement and the real operators controlling it. The protection layer mattered just as much. A compromised inspector could postpone a compliance visit. A brokerage contact could adjust a commodity description or hold a review in limbo. A bonded yard auditor could normalize a discrepancy that should have triggered escalation. Those were not dramatic acts. They were administrative nudges. But in a freight network, small nudges create safe windows. Agents also learned that the organization was compartmented by design. Drivers handled segments, not entire routes. Warehouse managers knew timing windows, not upstream suppliers. Dispatchers saw load codes, not final values. Financial operators handled invoices, rent, and account layering without touching the narcotics. That is why the case took time. The network had been built to prevent any single arrest from exposing the whole map. But once the FBI fused warehouse access logs, treasury tracing, DEA seizure data, and HSI customs records, the picture sharpened. South Florida was not the endpoint. It was the consolidation core. The cocaine arrived through maritime and overland channels, paused inside commercial inventory space, then moved north under the cover of lawful business tempo. That was the real mechanism. Not brute force, predictable infrastructure, quietly corrupted. The public face of the case became four names. Miguel Decker, 48, a controlled warehouse scheduling across 3 Medley properties and 1 bonded storage site in Hialeah. Employees described him as disciplined, quiet, and obsessed with dock timing. According to prosecutors, that was his value. He did not need to manage every load. He managed the pauses between them. Elena Torres handled the money and shell entities. Through Portline Administrative Services and 2 related holding companies, she moved funds into leases, equipment contracts, and real estate purchases tied to the warehouse belt. Her spreadsheets looked like commercial planning. Federal accountants said they were laundering instruments. Thomas Rourke, a private bonded yard auditor with prior customs contracting work, occupied the most sensitive gray zone in the case. He was not a public official in the classic sense. That he was a trusted compliance actor, positioned close enough to cargo review to reduce pressure at exactly the right moments. FBI agents later tied his phone to repeated green notifications sent before suspect loads cleared staging points. Maria Estevez, a county fire compliance inspector, became the institutional betrayal at the center of the corruption count. Records showed canceled visits, delayed reinspection notices, and unusual contact with warehouse operators already tied to narcotics movement. Prosecutors alleged she was paid to keep facilities off the enforcement calendar long enough for transfers to clear. Below them sat 9 downstream distribution crews stretching into Georgia, North Carolina, and New Jersey. Above them, federal filings referenced cartel-linked maritime suppliers and financial handlers outside immediate U.S. E-custody. No one person held the entire machine. That was the design. But once Decker's timing records were matched to Torres's money flow and Rourke's access alerts, the protective architecture became unmistakable. The takedown phase began under an operation title that later appeared in court filings and asset forfeiture notices. Operation Broken Pallet. Federal planners built it around the same reality the cartel had exploited for months. Freight moves by schedule. So would the raid. At 7:42 p.m. on a Sunday, synchronized warrants went live across South Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, and New Jersey. DEA strike teams hit the core warehouse targets. FBI public corruption squads moved on the compromised compliance actors and financial nodes. ICEHSI executed customs and bonded access warrants tied to maritime and cross-border documentation. Treasury transmitted emergency freeze orders to banks, title firms, and equipment lenders before most subjects understood the scale of the operation. The first wave landed in Medley and Hialeah. 4 warehouse doors came open within 9 minutes. At one site on Northwest 97th Avenue, agents found hidden pallet stacks concealing 2.1 tons of cocaine. At a second facility in Doral, a refrigeration repair room opened into a secondary storage chamber holding bulk cash, route ledgers, and access badges linked to 2 secured cargo yards. At the bonded site in Hialeah, agents recovered revised clearance documents and dispatch boards matching the flash drive codes from the first raid. Then the numbers accelerated. By midnight, 14 warehouses, yards, and associated facilities had been searched or secured. Total cocaine recovered across linked locations reached 9.3 tons. Immediate bulk cash seizures crossed $54 million. Treasury froze $312 million in accounts, properties, equipment, and commercial assets tied to the shell company network. 71 subjects were arrested in the first operational wave, with additional pickup warrants executed over the following 48 hours for a final total of 103 arrests. The corruption side hit just as hard. Maria Estevez was taken into custody outside her Kendall home. Thomas Rourke was arrested after agents seized devices showing inspection timing and hold window messaging. Elena Torres tried to move funds through a third-party escrow vehicle less than an hour after the first warrants were served. The transfer failed. Treasury had already frozen the line. What made the operation decisive was not simply the volume of cocaine or cash, it was the collapse of the protected lanes. Warehouses were dark, access badges were dead, shell accounts were frozen. Inspection manipulation had been exposed in documentary form. By dawn, investigators had not just raided hidden warehouses. They had broken the commercial framework that allowed those warehouses to function as a cartel logistics platform. The evidence catalog read like a merger between a narcotics indictment and an infrastructure audit. Agents logged 9.3 tons of cocaine, $54.2 million in bulk currency, 38 encrypted devices, 11 root ledgers, 73 firearms, 14 commercial properties or warehouse leases under seizure action, and a paper trail linking at least 26 shell entities to the freight network. A Treasury's financial review froze $312 million in accounts, real estate, trailers, forklifts, and equipment notes tied to the enterprise. The documentary evidence was more damaging than the product. Recovered records showed inspection delays aligned to freight movement windows, amended cargo descriptions submitted minutes before review, warehouse access rosters altered after hours, and payment chains connecting Portline Administrative Services to private compliance actors who had no legitimate reason to be in contact with operational warehouse staff. One ledger compared shipment losses before and after green contacts were activated. The drop in losses was stark. That is what transformed the case. The government was no longer arguing that corrupt actors happened to intersect with narcotics movement. And it was arguing that selective corruption materially improved the throughput of the cocaine network. The evidence supported that theory. Administrative protection had become part of the supply chain itself. By the time prosecutors organized the seizure boards for court, the case no longer looked like 14 separate warehouse raids. It looked like one embedded system, mapped in full. The human cost sat far from the loading docks. In Palm Beach County, 27-year-old Javier Morales was killed in a robbery tied to cocaine redistributed from one of the North Carolina cells, later linked back to the South Florida warehouse belt. In Newark, paramedic reports tied multiple overdose and violence events to the same eastbound corridor fed by the seized network. The cocaine moved as product. The damage moved as consequence. There was also a civic cost. Honest warehouse workers learned they had spent months handling inventory beside concealed narcotics caches without knowing it. Small freight firms operating near the compromised yards faced lost contracts and heightened scrutiny because the corridor itself had become contaminated. County inspectors and port employees who had done nothing wrong still watched public confidence collapse around the systems they represented. That is what infrastructure-based trafficking does. It does not only corrupt the guilty, it poisons the neutral ground around them. Leaseholds, inspection offices, cargo yards, trucking lanes, and ordinary commercial neighborhoods all become suspect once a cartel learns how to live inside them. The public sees the cocaine stacks on television. Investigators see something wider, trust converted into cover, and lawful systems taught to move unlawful power. The legal reckoning unfolded in layers. Lower-tier warehouse workers cooperated first. Drivers followed. Financial clerks moved quickly once federal accountants reconstructed the shell company flows. Elena Torres eventually pleaded to money laundering conspiracy, narcotics conspiracy, and asset concealment after prosecutors confronted her with synchronized banking records and lease files recovered during Operation Broken Pallet. Miguel Decker went to trial. For 6 weeks, jurors in federal court heard how a warehouse scheduler with no public title became the operational center of a cartel logistics corridor moving through South Florida. Prosecutors showed dock calendars, shift edits, access logs, coded route records, and then communications that lined up warehouse movement with compliance delays and protected review windows. The defense argued Decker managed chaotic freight businesses and was being blamed for a system larger than he understood. The jury rejected the distinction. Thomas Rourke, and Maria Estevez faced separate conspiracy and corruption counts tied to the protection layer. Federal filings described their conduct in plain terms. They reduced scrutiny long enough for contraband to keep moving. By the close of the first sentencing cycle, the case had produced 103 arrests, 9.3 tons of cocaine seized, $312 million in assets frozen, 14 warehouses and associated facilities raided, 11 supply routes disrupted, and a broader network of 136 suspects and facilitators exposed across 4 states and Caribbean-linked source channels. Now that sounds like an ending. It is not. 2 upstream maritime coordinators were never arrested. A Bahamas-linked shell network tied to vessel servicing remained under investigation. Treasury analysts later found fresh commercial registrations in South Florida using the same patterns that had defined the original architecture: low-volume freight firms, overlapping leases, proxy equipment ownership, and compliance contacts positioned just close enough to the system to soften risk. That is the final warning. A cartel does not need to own a city to exploit it. It only needs enough warehouse space, enough paperwork, and enough compromised timing to turn commercial routine into protected transit. The cocaine can be confiscated. The cash can be frozen. The buildings can be emptied. But if the infrastructure lesson survives, another network will study it, adapt it, and try again.